He thought he was just helping a lost grandmother find her way home. He had no idea he was holding the hand of a queen, and that his small act of kindness had just made him an untouchable king in a city of shadows. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking the city. It hammered against the rooftops of Chicago's Iron Triangle neighborhood, turning the streets into slick, black mirrors that reflected the bleary neon of pawn shops and tired old taverns. For Leo, every drop felt like a tiny reminder of his own failure. At 24, he was an artist without a canvas, a musician without an audience, and, as of this morning, a tenant who was exactly 1 month away from eviction. The city that was supposed to be his great escape had become a cage, and the walls were closing in with every tick of his landlord's clock. He walked with his head down, shoulders hunched against the wind, just another anonymous face in a crowd of people rushing to get somewhere warm, somewhere that wasn't here. He was so lost in his own bleak thoughts that he almost didn't see her. She was standing under the flickering awning of a closed butcher shop, looking as out of place as a forgotten memory. She was old, her hair a fine white mist under the stormy sky, her coat thin and worn. People flowed around her like a river around a stone, their umbrellas and hurried glances creating a bubble of indifference. They saw her, but they didn't see her. They saw a problem, a delay, a potential conversation they didn't have time for. They saw what Leo saw at first, a fragile, disoriented old woman. But as he drew closer, he saw something else in her eyes. It wasn't just confusion. It was a profound and terrifying loneliness. It was the same loneliness that echoed in his own empty apartment every night. He hesitated. He had his own problems, big ones. The rent money he was supposed to be scrounging for wasn't going to magically appear. Helping her would cost him time he didn't have. It was easier to just keep walking, to join the river of people and pretend she wasn't there. He took a step, and then another. But then he stopped. He thought of his own grandmother, years gone, how she would get lost in her stories at the end, her mind a beautiful, fading map. What if that were her, standing alone in the rain? He turned back, the weight of his own troubles suddenly feeling a little lighter than the weight of walking away. He approached her slowly, gently, as if not to startle a rare bird. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know what he would say or do. He only knew he couldn't leave her there. The city had ignored her, but in that moment he felt like the only person in the world who could see her clearly. And he was about to step into her bubble, not knowing it would change the entire trajectory of his life. Would you have stopped, or would you have kept walking? Comment below. I'd love to know what you would do in that situation. He came to a stop a few feet from her, the rain dripping from his worn jacket. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice soft, almost lost in the storm's fury. "Are you all right? Are you lost?" The old woman turned her head, her eyes a pale, cloudy blue. They seemed to look right through him for a moment, searching for a familiar landmark in a world that had suddenly become foreign. She clutched a small, dark leather purse to her chest, with hands wrinkled and frail, yet her grip was surprisingly strong. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she seemed to be listening to a conversation only she could hear. He saw the flicker of fear in her expression, the vulnerability of a mind adrift. I'm looking for Marco," she finally whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling. "He'll be waiting." He always waits. The name meant nothing to Leo, a random piece of a puzzle he couldn't see. "Marco?" he repeated. "Is that your husband? Do you know your address?" She shook her head, a slow, sad motion. "The house smells of basil," she offered, as if that were a street name. "And the front step is a little crooked. Marco always says he'll fix it." It was nothing. It was everything. It painted a picture of a life, a home, a love that was waiting for her somewhere out in this concrete maze. Leo felt a pang in his chest, a deep ache of empathy. This wasn't just a lost woman. This was the center of someone's universe, and she'd drifted out of orbit. His own problems, the rent, the empty fridge, the soul-crushing disappointment seemed to recede, replaced by a singular, urgent purpose. He had to get her home. "Okay," he said, forcing a reassuring smile. "My name is Leo. Why don't we find Marco together?" He held out his hand, an open invitation. For a long second she just stared at it. He saw the internal struggle in her eyes, the lifetime of warnings about talking to strangers, warring with the immediate, desperate need for help. Then slowly, she placed her small, cool hand in his. The contact was electric, a silent pact of trust. Her skin was like worn parchment, but her grip, like the one on her purse, was firm. It was a hand that had cooked 1,000 meals, mended clothes, and held a loved one's face. In that simple touch, he felt the weight of her entire history. He had no idea where they were going. He had no clue how he would find a man named Marco in a city of millions based on the smell of basil. But as he stood there in the pouring rain, holding the hand of a complete stranger, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just a struggling artist. He was a man with a mission. He was her anchor, and for now, that was enough. What he didn't know was that this simple gesture of taking her hand was being watched. From across the street, from the fogged-up window of a black sedan, a pair of eyes had been following her every move, and now they were focused squarely on him. The journey began with a single step into the deluge. They walked without a destination, a strange pair navigating the rain-lashed streets of the Iron Triangle. Leo held his arm, a makeshift umbrella, over her head as best he could, but the rain was relentless. She walked slowly, her steps uncertain on the cracked pavement, but she never let go of his hand. He asked her questions, gently probing her memory. "Do you remember the street name? Anything about the color of the door?" She would pause, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There are roses," she said once. "Red ones? Marco grows them. He says they're like my cheeks when I laugh." It was another beautiful, useless detail. The neighborhood was a patchwork of brick bungalows and 2 flats, many with small, carefully tended gardens. There were 100 houses with roses. With every block they walked, the city lights began to blur into a watercolor painting of orange and red. Leo's own building was in the opposite direction, and the thought of his cold, empty apartment and the looming eviction notice was a constant, dull throb in the back of his mind. He was cold, soaked through, and his stomach rumbled with a hunger he'd been ignoring all day. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill. It was his last one, meant for a loaf of bread and maybe some milk to last him the next 2 days. He looked at her, at the way she shivered, her lips a pale shade of blue. He didn't even hesitate. He guided her into a small, steamy coffee shop, the bell over the door jingling their arrival. The warmth was a physical shock. He sat her down at a small table and returned a moment later with a steaming cup of hot chocolate, placing it between her hands. He watched as she took a sip, a little color returning to her face. He bought nothing for himself. He just sat there, watching her, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction that was worth more than any meal. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at him with a newfound clarity. "You are a good boy, like my grandson." The moment was broken when 2 men at the counter, burly figures in leather jackets, got up to leave. As they passed their table, one of them slowed down, his eyes lingering on the old woman for just a second too long. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was an intensity, a flicker of something Leo couldn't decipher. Recognition? Concern? It made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He dismissed it as paranoia. After she finished her drink, they stepped back out into the rain. They had been walking for nearly an hour when she suddenly stopped. She pulled on his hand, her eyes fixed on a street sign half hidden by a tree branch. "Ravenswood," she read aloud, her voice filled with discovery. "I know this street." A surge of relief washed over Leo. Finally, a breakthrough. He led her down the block, his hope renewed. The houses here were a little nicer, the lawns a bit greener. And then he saw it. At the end of the cul-de-sac, parked under a weeping willow tree, was a black sedan. It was the same model he'd noticed earlier, its engine idling, its presence feeling heavy and ominous in the quiet residential street. Two men were inside, their faces obscured by the rain-streaked windshield. Were they waiting for someone, or had they been following them all along? The sight of the car sent a jolt of apprehension through Leo. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong. The men weren't police. The car was too luxurious, too private. It felt predatory. He slowed his pace, instinctively moving to place himself slightly in front of the old woman, a flimsy shield against a threat he couldn't define. Her grip on his hand tightened, but not out of fear. It was a sign of recognition. Her steps, which had been so hesitant, now became sure and steady. She was pulling him forward toward the vehicle. As they drew closer, the doors of the sedan opened. Two men emerged, large and imposing, dressed in dark, well-tailored suits that seemed impervious to the rain. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was unnerving. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He had stumbled into something far outside the realm of a simple good deed. This was trouble. He braced himself for a confrontation, for shouting, for violence, but none of that came. The men ignored him completely. Their focus was solely on the woman. They approached her not with menace, but with a deep, palpable reverence. "Nonna Isabella," one of them said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. He took her free hand and bowed his head slightly, almost kissing her knuckles. "We were so worried. The Don was about to tear the city apart." Nonna. Don. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications Leo couldn't yet grasp. Isabella looked at the man, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Rico, you worry too much. I was just taking a walk. This nice young man was helping me." Only then did the man named Rico turn his gaze to Leo. His eyes were dark and sharp, and in them Leo saw a quick, professional assessment. He was being weighed, measured, and judged in a split second. The man's expression was unreadable, a mask of hardened neutrality. "We thank you for your assistance," Rico said, his tone formal and clipped. It was a dismissal. The other man gently guided Isabella toward a modest but impeccably maintained brownstone behind the car. A light had just come on in the front window. The door opened before they even reached it. Leo was left standing on the wet sidewalk with Rico. "She is safe now," Rico stated. It wasn't a reassurance, it was an order. An order to leave. Leo nodded, unable to find his voice. He watched as Isabella disappeared inside the house, swallowed by a world he didn't belong to. He felt a sudden, profound emptiness. The mission was over. He turned and walked away, not looking back. The rain had soaked him to the bone, and a deep chill settled into his body that had nothing to do with the weather. He walked the long, lonely blocks back to his own apartment, the strange encounter replaying in his mind. He was just a guy who had tried to help. That was all. He put the key in his lock, pushed the door open, and stepped into the dim hallway. And there, taped to his door, was a bright pink piece of paper. An official notice of eviction. He had 30 days. He stared at the paper, the formal, unforgiving words blurring through his tired eyes. He had spent his last $10 and his last reserves of energy helping a stranger, and this was his reward. He had never felt more alone or more foolish in his entire life. The eviction notice was a physical manifestation of his failure. It stared at him from the door, its pink paper a mocking splash of color in his otherwise grey existence. For a full minute, Leo just stood there in his dripping coat, the reality of his situation crashing down on him with more force than the storm outside. 30 days, 4 weeks to come up with 2 months' rent, plus late fees, a sum that felt as unattainable as climbing Mount Everest. He had sacrificed his evening, a sliver of time he should have spent desperately applying for another dead-end job or sketching commissions he knew would never sell, all for a moment of misplaced altruism. And for what? To be dismissed on a curb by a man named Rico and left with an empty pocket and a looming eviction. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Good boy," Isabella had called him. It seemed being a good boy was a fast track to homelessness. He tore the notice from the door and stumbled into his small apartment. The place was sparse, furnished with cast-offs and his own unsold artwork leaning against the walls. It wasn't much, but it was his. The thought of losing it, of packing his few belongings into boxes and facing the indifferent streets, was suffocating. He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed his landlord's number. Mr. Silas was a man who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the misery of others. He answered on the second ring. "Yeah? Mr. Silas, it's Leo from 4B, he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I got the notice. I just need a little more time. I can get the money, I promise." Silas's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "Time? You've had time, kid. I'm not running a charity. You got 30 days, like the paper says. Pay up or get out. End of story." The line went dead. Leo sank onto his worn-out couch, the phone slipping from his hand. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket. He felt utterly and completely trapped. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety. He barely ate, his hunger replaced by a knot of dread in his stomach. He spent hours online searching for jobs, for loans, for any lifeline he could grab onto, but every door seemed to be locked. And then he started noticing the car. It was the same black sedan from that night. It would be parked across the street in the morning when he left to look for work, and it would be there in the evening when he returned, defeated. It never moved. The windows were tinted, impossible to see through, but he felt it. He felt them watching him. A new kind of fear, sharp and cold, began to creep in. This was no coincidence. It was connected to Isabella, to Rico, to the Don. Had he done something wrong? Did they think he had tried to harm her? Or was this some kind of intimidation? The questions spiraled in his mind, feeding a growing paranoia. He was just a nobody. Why would these powerful, dangerous people be interested in him? He started taking different routes home, peering over his shoulder, jumping at every shadow. His apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fishbowl. He was exposed, vulnerable, and being watched by predators he couldn't see. He was caught between two threats: the slow, bureaucratic cruelty of eviction and the silent, unknown menace of the men in the car. He didn't know which was worse. Had his one act of kindness marked him for ruin? The constant surveillance was a form of psychological torture. The black sedan became a fixed object in Leo's ever-shrinking world. It was a silent black shark circling his small island of despair. He started to feel like a ghost in his own life, haunted by the consequences of a single choice. Sleep offered little escape, his dreams filled with shadowy figures and the mocking pink of the eviction notice. He even considered going to the police, but the thought died as soon as it formed. What could he possibly say? That a car was legally parked on a public street? They would laugh him out of the station. He would sound like a paranoid crank. Besides, a deep, instinctual part of him knew that involving the authorities would be like throwing gasoline on a fire. These were not the kind of people you reported. These were the kind of people who made others disappear. He tried to focus on his problem, the eviction. He swallowed his pride and called the few friends he had, but they were all struggling just as much as he was. He sold his grandfather's old guitar, the last sentimental thing he owned, for a fraction of its worth. It still wasn't enough. The 30 days on the notice were ticking down like a time bomb, each passing day a small explosion of anxiety in his chest. His landlord, Mr. Silas, seemed to delight in his predicament. He would see Leo in the hallway and make a point of asking, "Got my money yet, Picasso?" with a sneer that made Leo's blood run cold. Silas was a small man who wielded his petty power like a club. He was the king of his crumbling little castle, and he enjoyed watching his tenants squirm. The fear of the men in the car and the dread of Silas began to merge into one overwhelming sense of being hunted. One afternoon, as Leo was returning from another fruitless job search, he saw Silas taping a fresh notice on the door of another tenant, a young single mother with 2 kids. The woman was pleading with him, tears in her eyes, and Silas was just shrugging, a smug look on his face. The casual cruelty of it all ignited something in Leo. He was tired of being scared, tired of feeling helpless. He was still going to lose his home, but he wouldn't let this man intimidate him any longer. The climax he'd been dreading arrived a week before his deadline. There was a loud, aggressive pounding on his door. It wasn't a knock, it was a demand. Leo opened it to find Mr. Silas standing there, his face flushed with anger. And flanking him like 2 gargoyles were a pair of heavy-set men Leo had never seen before. They were hired muscle, their purpose obvious. "Time's up, kid," Silas snarled, trying to push his way inside. "I'm here to inspect the property for vacancy." It was the moment he had feared for weeks, the final, humiliating act of his failure. But just as Silas took a step forward, a shadow fell over them. Leo looked past his landlord and saw 2 other figures emerge from the stairwell. It was Rico and the other man from the black sedan. They moved with a chilling, deliberate calm, and the entire atmosphere in the cramped hallway instantly changed from tense to glacial. They weren't looking at Leo, they were looking at Silas, and in their eyes was a look of such profound disappointment and cold fury that it made the air itself seem to crackle. Silas and his hired help froze, their bravado evaporating like mist. The landlord's smug expression was replaced by a sudden, dawning horror. He wasn't just looking at 2 men, he was looking at an institution. He was looking at the quiet, unwritten authority that had governed the Iron Triangle for generations. And he had just been caught breaking one of its most sacred, unspoken rules. Mr. Silas's face went from ruddy anger to a pasty, sickly white. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. He recognized the silent authority standing before him not by name, but by reputation, a reputation built over decades in the quiet alleys and backrooms of the Iron Triangle. His hired thugs, who had been puffing out their chests a moment ago, now seemed to shrink, trying to make themselves invisible. They stared at their shoes, at the peeling paint on the walls, anywhere but at the 2 men who now commanded the hallway. Rico didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply took a half step forward, a small movement that carried the weight of an earthquake. He looked at Silas, then his gaze drifted to the eviction notice still taped to Leo's door. He gently peeled it off, crumpled it into a ball with one hand, and let it drop to the floor. The sound of the paper hitting the linoleum was deafening in the silence. Still, no one spoke. The air was thick with unspoken history, with the knowledge of what these men represented. They were the neighborhood's memory, its enforcers of an older, unwritten law, a law that valued respect and took care of its own. Silas began to tremble, a slight, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a fish gasping for air. There's been a misunderstanding," he finally stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He looked at Leo, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading fear. "We can work something out. A payment plan, no problem. A misunderstanding." Rico's expression remained unchanged, a mask of cold granite. He simply held Silas's gaze for a few seconds longer, a silent transaction of power that sealed the landlord's fate more surely than any signed contract. The message was clear. "You have crossed a line. You will not cross it again." Silas and his 2 goons practically fell over themselves, backing away down the hall. They didn't walk, they fled. The sound of their footsteps clattering down the stairs was the only sound that followed. Leo stood in his doorway, his mind reeling. He was completely bewildered. One moment he was facing homelessness, the next his tormentor was running for his life. He looked at Rico, searching for an explanation. "You won't be bothered by him again," Rico said, his voice a low monotone. It wasn't a promise, It was a statement of fact. He then turned, and without another word, he and his partner walked back down the stairs and disappeared, their purpose fulfilled. Leo was left alone in the hallway, the crumpled eviction notice lying at his feet like a defeated enemy. The immediate threat was gone, but the mystery had deepened into an abyss. He hadn't been in danger from these men. He had been under their protection. But why? Why would these powerful, intimidating figures care about a struggling artist in a dead-end apartment? The answer, he knew, had to be Isabella, the lost old woman he had helped in the rain. He was beginning to understand that his small act of kindness had not been a mistake. It had been an investment in a currency he never knew existed. The silence that followed their departure was more profound than the noise of the confrontation. Leo leaned against his doorframe, his legs feeling weak. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a state of pure, unadulterated shock. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. The world, as he knew it, had been turned on its axis. The men he had feared, the silent watchers in the black sedan, were not his enemies. They were his guardians. The next morning, he woke up feeling like he had dreamed the entire episode. But the crumpled ball of paper still sat on his counter where he'd left it, a tangible reminder of the bizarre events. He half expected Silas to come back, his courage restored, but the day passed in an eerie quiet. There was no angry phone call, no new notice. It was as if Mr. Silas had ceased to exist. Around noon, there was a soft knock on his door. Leo's heart leaped into his throat, but it wasn't the landlord. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty. But on his doormat sat a simple cardboard box. There was no note, no sender. He cautiously brought it inside and placed it on his small kitchen table. He opened the flaps. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a loaf of freshly baked bread that was still warm, a wedge of sharp provolone cheese, a bottle of deep red wine, and a thick, white envelope. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. It was heavy. He tore it open and a stack of crisp $100 bills fell onto the table. He counted it, his hands shaking so much he had to start over twice. It was exactly enough to cover 3 months' rent, with a little left over. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't a life-changing jackpot. It was precise. It was a message. It was a provision, not a handout. It was a shield, not a weapon. This was repayment. This was a debt being settled. Leo sank into a chair, staring at the money, the bread, the wine. This was old-world currency, a language of honor and reciprocity he barely understood. These were the tools of a community taking care of its own. He looked out his window. The black sedan was gone. The street was just a street again. The feeling of being watched had been replaced by a new, more complex emotion. It was a mixture of gratitude, awe, and a healthy dose of fear. He now understood that he had stumbled into a hidden ecosystem that operated on a completely different set of rules. Loyalty was its foundation, and respect was its currency. His simple act of compassion for Isabella had been seen and recorded in a ledger he never knew existed. He was no longer just Leo, the struggling artist. He was someone who had shown kindness to their nonna. And in their world, that meant something. It meant everything. He still didn't have all the answers. He didn't know the full story of who Isabella was, or the extent of the power her family wielded. But he knew one thing for certain. He was safe. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he might actually have a future in this city. But the question still burned in his mind, a single, flickering flame of curiosity in the darkness of the unknown. Who was she? A week passed. Life settled into a new, surreal rhythm. The quiet on his floor was absolute. He never heard a peep from Mr. Silas again. The fear that had been his constant companion was replaced by a tentative sense of peace. He used the money to pay his rent, the transaction with the building's management office oddly smooth and unquestioning. He bought groceries, real groceries, and for the first time in months, his refrigerator wasn't empty. He even bought a new set of paints. He felt the stirrings of creativity returning, the oppressive weight of survival lifting just enough for his artistic soul to breathe again. Yet the mystery lingered. The question of why was a constant hum beneath the surface of his daily life. He found himself looking at the people in his neighborhood differently, wondering who was connected, who was part of this invisible web. The baker who gave him an extra pastry, the butcher who nodded to him with a newfound respect. Were they part of it? Or was he just imagining things? He knew he couldn't live in this state of unknowing forever. He needed answers, not just to satisfy his curiosity, but to understand the rules of the new world he had inadvertently entered. He needed to look his benefactor in the eye. The opportunity came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Another knock on his door, firm and deliberate this time. He opened it to find Rico standing there. In the daylight, without the backdrop of a crisis, he looked less menacing and more like a man burdened by immense responsibility. He was dressed in a simple polo shirt and slacks, but he carried the same aura of quiet authority. "Leo," he said, his voice even. It was the first time he had used his name. "Mr. Leone would like to see you?" The name clicked in his memory. Marco. The name Isabella had whispered in the rain. Mr. Leone. The Don. A knot of apprehension tightened in Leo's stomach. This was it. This was the invitation into the heart of the mystery. Fear mingled with a strange sense of inevitability. He had to go. There was no other choice. "Okay," Leo heard himself say, his voice calmer than he felt. He grabbed his jacket and followed Rico down to the street. The black sedan was waiting. This time, as he approached it, he didn't feel dread. He felt like he was crossing a threshold. Rico opened the back door for him, a gesture of formality that felt both respectful and deeply unsettling. Leo slid onto the soft leather seat. The interior of the car was immaculate, smelling faintly of leather and something else. Maybe cinnamon. It was the chariot of a king. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, gliding through the familiar streets of the Iron Triangle. But now Leo saw the neighborhood through new eyes. He saw the intricate network of relationships, the unspoken agreements, the deep, ancient roots that held this community together. They were taking him back to the brownstone, back to where it all started. His heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Was this an interrogation? A thank you? A warning? He was walking willingly into the lion's den. And he was about to meet the lion himself. The ride was short and silent. Rico drove with an effortless focus, his eyes on the road, leaving Leo to the whirlwind of his own thoughts. They pulled up to the same tidy brownstone where he had left Isabella. The red roses she had mentioned were blooming in defiance of the autumn chill, their petals a deep, velvety crimson. The front step was indeed a little crooked. Every small detail she had given him was true. This was her home. This was Marco's home. Rico led him up the path and opened the front door without knocking. He stepped into a world that was warm and alive. The air inside smelled of garlic, simmering tomatoes, and old, beloved furniture. It didn't feel like the headquarters of a crime lord. It felt like a grandmother's house. Family photos lined the walls, a chronicle of weddings, baptisms, and birthdays spanning generations. It was a house built on love and memory. Leo was led through the living room to a pair of dark wood doors at the back of the hall. Rico knocked once, softly. A voice from within, raspy with age but firm, called out, "Avanti, come in." Rico opened the door and gestured for Leo to enter, then closed it quietly behind him, leaving him alone with the man at the desk. The study was filled with books. Floor-to-ceiling shelves overflowed with leather-bound volumes of history, philosophy, and poetry. The man sitting in a large leather chair behind a massive mahogany desk didn't look up immediately. He was focused on cleaning a pair of spectacles with a small piece of cloth. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s, with a full head of silver hair swept back from a deeply lined forehead. He wore a simple cashmere sweater. When he finally looked up, his eyes were the most striking feature. They were a startlingly clear shade of brown, intelligent and weary, and they held the accumulated weight of a long and complicated life. This was Marco Leone. There was no menace in his presence, only a profound, unshakable gravity. He was the center of his own universe, and everything revolved around him. "Mr. Leo," he said, his voice calm and measured. He gestured to a chair opposite the desk. "Please, sit. Thank you for coming." Leo sat down, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Marco Leone smiled, a faint, sad smile. "My wife, Isabella, she has moments now when the world becomes a little confused for her. That day she wandered. It has happened before, but never for so long. I was a man on fire with worry." He paused, his gaze becoming more intense. He wasn't just looking at Leo, he was reading him. "My men were looking for her. They saw you. They saw everyone walk past her. They saw the looks on their faces, annoyance, impatience, indifference. In a city of millions, my wife was invisible." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Leo's. "But you saw her. You stopped. You spent your last dollar to buy her a hot chocolate. You walked with her for an hour in the pouring rain, trying to find a home you had no address for. You showed my wife honor when the world showed her none. In our family, Mr. Leo, that is not a small thing. It is the only thing. It is a debt that must be repaid." The weight of Marco Leone's words settled over Leo, a heavy cloak of understanding. This wasn't about crime or power in the way the movies portrayed it. This was about a simpler, more profound code. It was about honor. It was about family. Marco leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning softly. "For 50 years, this neighborhood has been my family. Not just the people who share my blood, but the people who share my values. We look after our own. We protect the weak from the strong. We ensure that respect is given where it is due. We are the old way, in a world that has forgotten how to be." He spoke not with bravado, but with a quiet, certain dignity. "My men, they did not just see your kindness. They are thorough. They saw your life, the eviction notice, the empty cupboards, the landlord, a man who preys on good people like a jackal. They saw a good man, a man of honor, being crushed by a world that has no honor." Leo felt exposed, as if the entire fabric of his life had been examined under a microscope. But it wasn't a violation, it was a validation. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not for his failures, but for his character. "We do not interfere in the affairs of others," Marco continued, his voice dropping lower. "It is not our way. We believe a man should stand on his own 2 feet, but the rules change when one of our own is threatened. That landlord, Mr. Silas, he did not just threaten you, he threatened a friend of the Leone family. That is a mistake he will not make again. A friend of the family." The phrase echoed in the quiet study. It was a title, a designation, a shield. It was the explanation for everything. The car, the protection, the money, the sudden disappearance of his problems. "When you took my Isabella's hand," Marco said, his voice softening with emotion as he spoke of his wife. "You took our hand. You showed loyalty to a stranger, which is the purest form of loyalty there is. You became part of our circle. Not by blood, not by oath, but by character." He fell silent for a moment, letting the magnitude of his words sink in. This was the revelation. This was the answer to every question Leo had. His single, simple act of compassion hadn't just saved a lost woman. It had initiated him into a hidden world, a world where a gesture of kindness was worth more than all the money in a landlord's greedy pockets. Marco's gaze was unwavering, filled with a paternal warmth that took Leo by surprise. The money, the rent, that is a small thing, a gift to help a friend get back on his feet. The real gift is something else. It is the knowledge that you are no longer alone in this city. The weight of that statement was immense. He was being offered more than safety, more than money. He was being offered a place to belong. He had spent years feeling like an outsider, a ghost, and now he was being told he was family. Leo left the brownstone in a daze, the world outside seeming both brighter and more complex than it had an hour before. Rico drove him home in the same respectful silence, but this time it didn't feel tense. It felt comfortable. When he stepped out of the car, Rico gave him a slight nod. It was a small gesture, but it was a gesture between equals. It was a sign of acceptance. In the days and weeks that followed, Leo's life began to change in ways both subtle and profound. The protection he'd been given wasn't a one-time event. It was a constant, invisible presence. He was no longer just a tenant in the building. He was the kid from 4B. He noticed it in small ways. The gruff superintendent, who had never given him the time of day, now fixed his leaky faucet within an hour of him reporting it. The noisy neighbors upstairs suddenly became library quiet. He was living under the silent, benevolent umbrella of the Leone family. The change rippled out into the neighborhood. When he went to Gallucci's bakery, old Mr. Gallucci, a man who hadn't smiled since 1987, would slip an extra cannoli into his bag. For the artist, he'd say with a wink. At the butcher shop, the owner would save him the best cuts. "Gotta keep up your strength," he'd grunt. They all knew. The network, the community, had been alerted. A friend of the family was living among them. He was treated with a warmth and respect that felt both humbling and empowering. It wasn't about fear. No one was afraid of him. It was about his connection to them, to their nonna, their patriarch. He was one of them now. The most significant change, however, happened within himself. Freed from the crushing anxiety of survival, his creativity blossomed. He painted with a passion he hadn't felt in years. His canvases, once dark and somber, were now filled with the vibrant life of the Iron Triangle, with the faces of the people he was getting to know. One afternoon, Rico showed up at his door again. This time, he was smiling. "The community center on 8th Street," he said. "The wall on the west side is an eyesore. Mr. Leone thought it could use a mural. Thought you might be the man for the job. It's a paid commission, of course." It was his first real break as an artist, a chance to create something permanent, something for the whole neighborhood to see. It wasn't charity. It was an opportunity, an investment in the talent of one of their own. He was no longer a struggling artist fighting for scraps. He was the neighborhood's artist. As he stood on the sidewalk sketching out his ideas for the mural, he saw her. Isabella was sitting on a bench in the small park across the street, watching the children play. She was lucid today, her eyes clear and bright. He wondered if she would even remember him. He had to know. He put down his sketchbook and walked across the street, his heart a little unsteady. Would she recognize the boy who had held her hand in the rain? He approached the bench slowly, not wanting to startle her. She was watching a group of children chase pigeons, a gentle smile on her face. The afternoon sun caught the silver in her hair, creating a soft halo around her. She looked peaceful, regal in her own quiet way. "Hello," Leo said softly. She turned her head and her blue eyes met his. There wasn't the fog of confusion he had seen before. There was only a calm, knowing light. For a moment, she studied his face, and he held his breath. He didn't need her to remember the details of that rainy night. He just hoped she remembered the feeling. Her smile widened, crinkling the corners of her eyes. She patted the empty space on the bench beside her. "The boy with the kind hands," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Sit with me." Relief and a deep, profound joy washed over Leo. He sat down next to her. She remembered. Not his name, not the coffee shop, but the essence of who he had been to her in that moment of fear. She remembered his kindness. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, watching the world go by. It wasn't awkward or strange. It felt natural, like sitting with his own grandmother. He was no longer a stranger to her, nor she to him. "Marco tells me you are an artist," she said, finally breaking the silence. "You are painting our wall." "I am," Leo replied, a proud smile spreading across his face. "I'm honored to do it. It is good," she said, nodding. "This place needs more beauty. You have a good heart. It shows in your hands and it will show in your art." She reached over and patted his hand, the same one he had offered her in the storm. Her touch was warm and reassuring. It was a gesture of affection, of acceptance. It was the closing of a circle that had begun with a simple act of trust. At that moment, Marco Leone himself appeared, walking slowly with the aid of a simple wooden cane. He stopped in front of the bench, a warm look on his face as he saw them sitting together. "I see you've met our neighborhood artist, my love," he said to Isabella. She beamed up at him. "He is a good boy, Marco, a very good boy." Marco looked at Leo, and his eyes were filled with a deep, paternal gratitude. He placed his free hand on Leo's shoulder, the weight of it both grounding and significant. "Family doesn't have to be blood, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about who you show up for when the storm comes. It's a choice, and we are glad you made yours." Leo looked from Marco's strong, kind face to Isabella's gentle smile. In this small park, in the heart of a neighborhood he had once felt so lost in, he had found something he thought he had lost forever. He had found a home. Leo understood then that the Mafia he had read about in books and seen in movies was a caricature, a shadow of a much more complex truth. What he had found was not an organization of criminals, but a family. It was an old-world tribe surviving in the modern age, bound by codes of honor and loyalty that the rest of the world had discarded as obsolete. It was a system of mutual support, a quiet promise that no one who belonged would ever have to face the cold indifference of the world alone. His life had been transformed not by a sudden windfall of cash or a magical solution to all his problems, but by something far more valuable: community. He was no longer an island. He was part of an archipelago, connected by invisible bridges of respect and reciprocity. His mural on the community center became a landmark. It was a vibrant, sprawling piece that told the story of the Iron Triangle, its struggles, its history, and its people. He painted the faces of the baker, the butcher, and the children in the park. And in the center, he painted an old woman with kind eyes and an old man with a dignified smile, standing in a garden of red roses. It was his gift back to them, his thank you note, written in brilliant color on a brick wall. He never became rich, but he never worried about rent again. His art commissions, arranged through the quiet network of the Leone family's influence, were steady. He made a name for himself as an artist of the people, but more than that, he had a seat at the Sunday dinners at the Leone house, a place where the smell of basil and tomato sauce was always in the air. He would listen to Marco's stories of the old days and watch the tender way he still cared for Isabella, whose mind continued its slow, gentle fade. On those days, she might not remember his name, but she would always reach for his hand, and he would always take it. His single decision to stop on a rainy night to offer his hand to a stranger when everyone else walked by had not been a detour from his life's path. It had been the path itself. It taught him that the greatest fortunes are not held in a bank, but in the hearts of the people who stand by you. He learned that in a world that often rewards selfishness, a single act of selfless compassion can have the power to rewrite your entire story, protecting you in ways you could never imagine and giving you a family where you least expect it. He wasn't just Leo the artist, he was Leo the boy with the kind hands. And in the Iron Triangle, that was more than enough. Sometimes a small act of kindness can change a life, not just for the person you help, but for you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment like that? Share your story in the comments below. We could all use a little more hope. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and turn on notifications for more heartfelt tales that remind us of the power of human connection.